of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
The ayes are 54, the nays are 45. The nomination is confirmed.
Tonight, the Fed's new chair, Kevin Warsh, is confirmed by the Senate as the next chair of the Federal Reserve, inheriting no shortage of challenges. Wholesale inflation just posted its biggest annual advance in 3 years. The Strait of Hormuz remains blocked, and President Trump has made it clear he wants rate cuts. Plus, summit set to begin. President Trump and China's Xi Jinping are set to meet in a few hours. The world's two largest economies looking to stabilize ties as the war in Iran looms over the talks. And The View from the Hill will get reaction to these developments from both sides of the aisle this hour as Senators Richard Blumenthal and Dave McCormick join us. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew on Capitol Hill tonight. And of course, Joe, it was in the Senate that we saw Warsh confirmed this afternoon. That may, though, be the easy part. The hard part is likely still ahead of him.
Well, that's very true. And in fact, I think we can say that definitively, Kaylee, as Chair Warsh, now we got used to saying that, is going to be walking into the building here just down Pennsylvania Avenue or down Constitution from where I am here up on Capitol Hill with the landscape that is quite different than when he was nominated. Of course, knowing that this war is underway now for the better part of 2 months and sending oil prices into the triple digits. Gasoline prices $4.50 averaging across the country now. And you just mentioned the data today, Kaylee. PPI following CPI with the biggest increases in prices we've seen since 2022. And those energy prices are starting to get into the core, which has a lot of economists worried.
Yeah, and we'll have more on that data tonight and more from Joe on Capitol Hill in a moment. But we begin this evening in China as President Trump's summit with Xi Jinping is set to begin just hours from now. Bloomberg's Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall is joining us live from Beijing with more. So, Tyler, walk us through what we're going to see over the course of the day's events.
Hey, Kaylee. Well, at the moment, we're about 5 hours away from President Trump meeting face-to-face with Chinese President Xi Jinping in a private, closed-door bilateral meeting. Then later in the evening, we're expecting a state banquet to commence where we could see some more of those tech CEOs that are now here in Beijing for this visit emerge. We'll have to see what sort of headlines we get out of tomorrow. This is going to be a whirlwind 36-hour visit for President Trump here in China, followed by some events on Friday, too. But so far, this White House is maintaining that we will get some deliverables mainly related to trade. We are watching very closely what sort of potential purchase agreements or commitments from China may come from this meeting, mainly in regards to U.S. agricultural goods. I'm tracking soybeans and corn, energy products, and also importantly, potentially Boeing aircraft, mainly the 737 jets, because at this point, we've really seen the administration try to push forward the economic agenda. Maybe we'll get some sort of extension when it comes to the U.S. trade truce, though that doesn't expire until November, so there may be a little bit of leeway here. Instead, our own analysts at Bloomberg Economics have said that this visit is very much focused on keeping the stability in the U.S.-China relationship rather than making substantial progress, though there are other areas as well that we will likely see the two leaders highlight. I will quickly mention, and I would be remiss if I didn't, that the NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang caught a last-minute ride on Air Force One over here to Beijing. That's going to put artificial intelligence at the front of the agenda as well, and questions about whether or not President Trump will press Chinese President Xi Jinping to allow Chinese companies to purchase and import those H200 NVIDIA chips. And then lastly, of course, looming very large over this meeting is the issue of Iran, even as President Trump says that that is not going to be a priority in their conversations.
Well, if it's not going to be a priority, Tyler, do we have a sense as to whether or not we're going to get any readout at all as to what happens in the more diplomatic, geopolitical focused part of these conversations, or is it just going to be in the announcement of business deals?
Well, at this point, Kaylee, we're going to have to wait and see. Of course, Iran is going to be looming very large over this conversation as we wait for what the next U.S. response is going to be. President Trump said that on the plane ride over, he and his team were going to discuss what the red lines would be in order for the U.S. to end its ceasefire. We should mention that Secretary of State Marco Rubio, as well as Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, are here on the ground as well, which is, of course, going to add to these conversations. And President Trump said yesterday that the U.S. doesn't need any help in terms of ending the conflict. But it is important to mention that he also alluded to the fact that he would be asking Chinese President Xi Jinping for whatever he could do to get Iran to the negotiating table in a more meaningful way. In fact, underscoring that, a senior U.S. administration official who briefed us ahead of this trip said that behind closed doors, President Trump will push back when it comes to China's stance on Iran, including that Beijing remains the largest importer of Iranian crude. So a lot to watch for here. I would expect we'd get a readout. That typically is what happens during these meetings. But at this point, so far, the updates have been coming directly from President Trump himself, including on social media.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall reporting live from Beijing. Thank you so much. And let's check back in now with Joe on Capitol Hill.
All right, Kaylee, thank you so much. And joining us live now on the Hill is Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, who serves on both the Senate Armed Services Committee as well as Senate Homeland Security Committee. And Senator, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV. Thanks for giving us your time. I'd like to start with the matter of Iran, as we just heard from Tyler, who's watching this unfold just as the president touches down in Beijing. And it does feel like a fairly urgent moment, as the New York Times reports today that Iran has somehow reconstituted its missile program, reactivating its missile sites, and has more missiles in inventory than we had previously known about. Can you confirm that reporting? Have you heard anything like this on the committee level?
Well, I am limited in what I can say because
Understood.
a lot of what I know comes from classified briefings. But what's in the New York Times is certainly no surprise. It is consistent with what I have been told by very reliable sources. And I will say, Joe, that it should be no surprise to the American public, because a lot of these missiles and missile launchers were buried underground.
Yeah.
Now they have taken them above ground. Perhaps 70% of their pre-war missiles and 75% of their missile launchers, they are mobile.
Yep.
So they're much harder to hit. In the meantime, we've expended about 1,100 stealth cruise missiles, about 1,000 Tomahawk missiles, 1,300 Patriot interceptors. That's 2 years of production of interceptors. So the message here really is that Iran still has a very powerful capacity to attack ships in the Strait of Hormuz. 30 out of the 33 launching sites are still operational to one degree or another, and that poses a major dilemma for President Trump. He is really stuck because he's accomplished none of his objectives at the start of the war, and the path to negotiations is a very difficult one.
But, Senator, the president said we already won. Militarily, we've won.
Well, the American people are going to judge for themselves, and I think there ought to be a congressional investigation about how we got into the war.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I think that the evidence shows that the Revolutionary Guard and the hardcore leadership is still there. In fact, they're more hardcore than ever before, and they're firmly in control. The enriched uranium is still there.
Yeah.
We haven't secured it. The capacity to make mischief through Hezbollah and other proxies still there. And of course, the missiles and the launchers are still there. Now, what he has done, got to give some credit here, is to destroy probably the production capacity for those missiles and the launchers.
So all of this said, if 30 out of 33 missile sites along the strait are intact, if I remember those numbers correctly, is it not time to resume strikes?
Well, it would be if the expectation in the military is that it would be successful in destroying those launchers and the missiles.
Yeah.
But it's no simple or easy task to do so. And even if those launchers and missiles are destroyed, there are the fast attack boats, there are other kinds of arms that exist. So the president's in a difficult position. The United States is in a real dilemma here because Iran is insisting on continued control of the Strait of Hormuz, and that gives it a chokehold on the world's economy.
So a couple of questions to follow on there, because obviously we've got repercussions here at home, even as the president touches down in China. I'll ask you about gas prices in a moment, but do you think that the president is willing to make a deal with Xi Jinping for assistance in reopening the strait? And what would that deal look like?
Very hard to know, Joe, because
Taiwan?
The extent of Xi's control over the Iran leadership is very problematic and uncertain.
Yeah.
And in fact, here's another really important aspect of the president's dilemma, and the reason why this miscalculation on the war is so deeply destructive to our credibility as well as our economic position. Iran's leadership now is somewhat divided. So the question of how to negotiate with it, how Xi would possibly exert some influence is very uncertain and problematic. So we have, in effect, you could argue, and I have argued, worsened our position vis-a-vis Iran as a result of the war of choice, which involves not only illegality, but also a really dire miscalculation.
Well, we've got $4.50 gas nationally now. I checked out AAA. I think you're at $4.61 in Connecticut. You're topping the national average. Do you support suspending the gas tax, or does it not make enough difference to raid the highway fund?
I support suspending the gas tax. There are other sources to fund the Highway Trust Fund. But make no mistake, Joe, the suspension of the gas tax will make really a very marginal difference in what consumers pay at the pump. 18.4 cents is not a lot of money when you consider gas prices going to $4.60 a gallon right now, and they're headed higher. In fact, I would predict to you that they may well break $5 a gallon in Connecticut by the end of the week.
Wow.
But it isn't only gasoline prices. As you pointed out at the very start of the show, the prices of fuel, of oil and gas are going through the whole economy. All products made with petrochemicals are going to be affected. Everything from plastics to medical devices to mattresses to semiconductors. Our whole economy is at stake here, the world's economy, and we don't exist in a void or a vacuum.
Since we're talking about issues at home, I want to ask you about something that's important to you before you leave us, and that is the Kids Online Safety Act, which you are reintroducing, I believe with Marsha Blackburn as your partner. Does it need to be tweaked, rewritten to acknowledge advancements in AI?
This bill is a standalone bill that deals with the product design of the internet right now, which involves algorithms driving toxic content at children, bullying, eating disorders, suicide ideation. And just today, we had testimony from 2 moms whose children took their own lives as a result of what they saw on the internet, and the business model, which is more eyeballs for more periods of time, which means more advertising revenue, which means more dollars. And it is a question of product design that would impose a duty of care on big tech. So regardless of whether AI or algorithms or some other technology is involved, that duty of care would force them to take account of whether their product is harming people, whether they should know it harms people. So the bill that we have right now should be approved. We have 75 co-sponsors already. It passed the Senate last time, overwhelmingly bipartisan, 91-3. I'm hoping it will again very promptly and pass the House as well.
Just lastly, does it make you nervous to see Mark Zuckerberg, Jensen Huang in China with Donald Trump?
Makes me very nervous because it may well be more pay to play. Mark Zuckerberg has been treated very well by this administration. He was treated very badly by a jury in California, which judged that Instagram and Meta are responsible for the deaths and injuries to children, even after his testimony. Apparently the jury didn't believe him, but his accompanying the president on this trip, along with other corporate executives, indicates that the administration may be granting them favors for either campaign contributions or some other kinds of favors that they may provide.
It sounds like we have a lot to follow up with you on, Senator, and I appreciate you joining us today. Let's do it again soon.
Thank you,
These
Joe.
issues won't be going away anytime soon. That's, of course, Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut with us live on Capitol Hill. Let's check back in with Kaylee in our Washington bureau. Kaylee?
Well, Joe, thank you. Of course, as he's talking about all of the CEOs en route to China, the inclusion and the boarding of the plane in Anchorage of NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang sent that stock higher today. It helped lead a rally in tech stocks that pushed, once again, equity markets to all-time highs in the U.S., even in the face of hotter inflation data. So for more on that, we turn to power moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick joining us live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine.
Yeah, Kaylee, and we should point out that the news that Jensen Huang was actually traveling as well not only lit a fire under U.S. tech stocks, but Chinese tech stocks as well. In fact, that China Golden Dragon Index having its best day going back to January, with a lot of the names in that Chinese space of the AI and tech space rallying hard here on the day. And that is the fundamental story that we continue to see in U.S. markets, with the NASDAQ and the S&P hitting yet another record high, powered almost primarily by those chip names like your NVIDIAs, your Qualcomms, and Microns. The CEO of each of those three companies traveling to China, as well as was Tim Cook, the outgoing CEO of Apple. And this general idea here that maybe potentially they could bring something back. Of course, Richard Blumenthal, the senator there, was kind of alluding to that, not necessarily in the most positive light. But for investors, that seems to be what they're focused on. Remember, this AI story, at least in terms of revenue growth and profitability, has been a U.S. story, largely because of a lot of the controls that both the U.S. has placed as well as China has placed on the transfer of that technology across the border. No one really knows how much of that is going to be on the table and whether Trump can actually deliver on that. But that is the hope right now, Kaylee, that will actually happen, and that will continue to power this market. And again, a market that we should, of course, point out is kind of shrugging its shoulders in the face of those two big inflation reports that we got over the last 24 to 48 hours.
Well, yeah, that's what I wanted to ask about, Romaine, because this inflation is hot, like going back to 2022, hot. It's a rough thing to inherit for Kevin Warsh, who was just confirmed as chair of the Federal Reserve. It's going to be pretty hard for him to cut rates, no?
Yeah, I mean, that is the consensus right now, is that rate cuts for the most part off the table for 2026. Though we should point out, a lot of folks we've talked to on the close says don't necessarily expect rate hikes either. And I was talking yesterday with you and Joe about this idea of kind of the K-shaped nature of the economy, the K-shaped nature of the stock market. But you also see that in the Treasury space, really reflected today, with yields on the short end of the curve, basically what the Fed controls, moving lower, slightly lower. However, yields on the longer end of the curve moving higher. And a lot of that was reflected in a big Treasury auction we had, Kaylee, that 30-year bond auction that came out earlier today. The Treasury had to promise 5.046% to get those bidders in, and that's significant. That was the highest that they've ever had to pay. In fact, the first time they've had to pay above 5% on a 30-year auction since 2007. And that gives you a sense that there are a lot of concerns right now about how much you're going to be compensated for that inflation risk that was front and center in that PPI report this morning and that CPI report yesterday.
All right, Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, thank you so much for joining us. And we have more coming up, more on today's inflation figures and Warsh's confirmation, as we were just discussing, as the new Fed chair, in our conversation with Republican Senator Dave McCormick of Pennsylvania. Next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The ayes are 54, the nays are 45. The nomination is confirmed.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kaylee Lines in our Washington bureau. I'm Joe Matthew on Capitol Hill with the sound there of Kevin Warsh being confirmed by the Senate as the next chair of the Federal Reserve. You heard the vote, 54-45, and that is the slimmest margin for a central bank chief. Joining us now here with more on this important day on Capitol Hill is Bloomberg's Michael McKee. So he got the vote. Does the partisan nature of this vote color the start of his chairmanship?
No, everybody expected it to be a partisan vote. It's been a partisan effort to get him on the Federal Reserve and to get him as chairman. We saw the vote on Lisa Cook when she was nominated was a one vote margin. for her to be confirmed to the Board of Governors. That was when Democrats were in charge and Republicans were trying to block that. So this is what happens. Okay. It's Washington, and everybody will forget about it very shortly.
Well, he's going to have quite the job ahead of him when he starts here, as long as this war continues. And we saw the initial cracks in the PPI today, CPI yesterday, of just how bad this might get. Biggest surge since 2022, and a market that's now betting that a rate hike is more likely than a cut. Does he need to stay away from Truth Social?
Well, I would avoid putting any money on a rate hike, and I think that'll go away because the markets go up and down based on what we see on a day-to-day basis. But it's not going to be possible for him to cut interest rates anytime soon, not with inflation going up. The rest of the Open Market Committee won't go along with it, and the markets won't go along with it. So it's going to be a few meetings before we know whether this is going to continue. Most analysts think that the strait being closed, even if the war ended tomorrow, would have inflationary impacts until the fall. So it may be September, October before there's even a sign that inflation is really going down, and until then they can't even really make the case for it.
So what's the first thing Warsh does when he gets in the building?
Says hello to the doorman? No, there's no doorman there, so he can't do that.
Just a lot of hard hats.
I think what he'll end up doing is obviously he knows the people there, but he's going to, get back in touch with them and sound everybody out. And he's got a number of reforms to Fed process that he can work on, like the SEP, the dot plot, things like that he can start talking to people about. He can start talking about lowering the balance sheet. That's going to take a long time to get through. But there are things he can work on in the meantime. We're all going to be watching the first meeting because it's going to be less about monetary policy since they can't do anything, and it's going to be about Kevin Warsh.
Right.
Does he change the statement? Does he have a news conference? We don't know yet.
And Jay Powell will be at that meeting, right?
Jay Powell will be at that meeting, but I'm sure he will do his best to make sure that we don't see him.
Right, understood. Great to have you, as always, in Washington. Bloomberg's Michael McKee with us here on Balance of Power. And I talked just a short time ago before we came to air with Republican Senator Dave McCormick of Pennsylvania, who serves, of course, on the Senate Banking Committee, but also was the man who introduced Warsh at his confirmation hearing. And I started by asking him the same thing I just asked Michael. What will be the chair's first action once he gets in the building? Listen.
He's a guy who understands financial markets. He's had experience in markets, understands the Fed. He's got a reformer's heart, reformer's mindset, and it's going to need reform. And the thing he said, which I thought was interesting, how he wants to run the Fed, it's going to be messy. He wants to have family meetings where they sit and talk and debate how to handle it. And he's got a very clear view on the reforms that are needed, shrinking the balance sheet. He also has a very firm view that this AI revolution we're experiencing is going to increase productivity and be deflationary. And getting those views and debating those views with other members of the Fed, I think, will be the starting point. Taking stock of where we are and beginning to lay the predicate for where the Fed takes us in the future, and doing it in a very thoughtful, clearly communicated way.
That reformer has indicated he wants to shrink the balance sheet, right? And also change the metrics for the way we look at inflation and make interest rate decisions. Will he have consensus on
Well, that was what I thought was great about his testimony. He said, I think he's someone who will be able to forge consensus. I don't think he's going to start with consensus.
Right.
I think they're going to have to review the data together. I think they're going to think about data differently. I think they're going to have to take into account that we're in the middle of a sort of a very atypical situation with the conflict in Iran.
Right.
And I think he'll build consensus over time with a Fed that hasn't had that kind of strong leadership and also hasn't embraced the notion that they need to have that kind of open debate.
Well, let's talk for a minute about that atypical situation, because he's coming into a landscape that is not very friendly to the idea of interest rate cuts. When you look at the PPI today, the CPI yesterday, it's not only impacting energy, and I see that you're paying over $4.60 a gallon in your state, higher than the national average, but it's starting to creep into the core. Yeah. Will he effectively be handcuffed?
Well, certainly,
when it comes to rates, as long as this war is underway?
Certainly the Feds, they're going to have to consider the shock underway, and it clearly is having an impact in Pennsylvania. When you talk about families living paycheck to paycheck, the fact that they're dealing with a $1.20 increase in gas prices, it's affecting them, folks that are kind of living on the edge. So it's definitely a big deal. I think and continue to think, as I've said, that we will find an end to this conflict relatively quickly, and when we do, I think you're going to see energy markets adjust relatively quickly as well. So I think they'll have to look at this as a moment which ultimately they're going to have to look past this. Yeah. But it's definitely putting all sorts of complexity into the moment. Well, sure. In terms of Fed.
President Trump he's a businessman. Does he understand that? Will he give the chair space to figure that out in his first couple of months, first couple of meetings?
I think President Trump picked a guy that he trusts. And he picked a guy that he thinks has the ability, and I think he's right, to drive the Fed in the right direction over time. I don't think he's going to be given, in his mind, a performance review on Kevin Warsh in the first 60 days. Okay. I think he knows that the chairman's going to have to sort of get his bearings and begin to build the consensus he needs.
I'm sure Chair would like to hear you say that. Yeah. How about the building renovations? Does Kevin Warsh change anything that's already underway at the Eccles building?
I'm not close enough that to know. I mean, what I'd always said on this was, listen, it looks clear that there was an enormous amount of spending, probably overspending, excessive, and that we need to make sure that was handled appropriately. It looks like it was mismanaged. That wasn't the means or the justification for a criminal prosecution. Sure. The IG is now looking at it. I think the Senate Banking Committee should certainly play a role in oversight. I think that's not going to be the focus of the new Fed chair. I think the Fed chair is going to focus on the dynamics of this economy, this revolution underway with AI and energy and what that means for the medium term and long term, combined with the near-term shock we have from the conflict in Iran and how to navigate through those two things at the same time. Yeah.
Well, we talk about
in an economy that has many things that are very strong. There's the challenges you mentioned, but I mean, you look at the job numbers, you look at GDP, and despite the government shutdown and all those things, we have an economy that is moving through this. I was just in Pennsylvania last week and visited a number of these projects where, I mean, you've got these huge investments of
data center projects,
data centers transitioning coal to natural gas. I mean, across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, whether it's the Hanwha acquisition of the Philadelphia shipyard, or whether it's Japan investing in Westinghouse, or whether it's AWS investing in big data centers, we've got a lot of inbound investment, and you're starting to see that impact jobs and the economy in a very positive way.
Could you help the people in your state and maybe help the Fed along with its job by suspending the federal gas tax? Would that make the difference? Do you support it?
Listen, I think given that point I made earlier about people living paycheck to paycheck, I would be supportive of that idea. Okay. I think that would give temporary relief. It's problematic in some ways because it takes away funding from so it's not.
Should it sunset at some point so you don't have to have a whole debate about reinstating the gas tax?
I absolutely think it should sunset as we exit Iran and the conflict with Iran and energy prices stabilize. So I wouldn't want this to be one of those Washington things that was supposed to be temporary and becomes permanent.
A big day tomorrow with the Clarity Act. Yeah. I know this is something that's getting awfully close to the finish line. If you've got stablecoin yield worked out, you tell me if I'm wrong. If community bankers are happy, does Kevin Warsh support what's in this bill?
Well, I'm not sure everybody's happy. I'm not sure everybody's
nobody's
going to be happy in a piece of legislation. I think it's I think we're in a good place. I think this will be a strong markup. Yeah. I think we'll move forward on this, and I think we've resolved really the stickiest issue, which is there's going to be rewards on activity-based, but not rewards on anything that looks like or is a deposit.
Understood.
And that's a compromise that I think makes sense and is going to allow this industry to innovate, give consumer protection, at the same time give community banks in Pennsylvania and elsewhere an avenue to also build up their stablecoin position. So I think we're at a good spot. We'll see the markup tomorrow, and we need to get this to the floor and get it passed. Yep. This is a burgeoning industry. It's creating jobs in Pennsylvania, and it's being embraced by people across the U.S., and we need to have this innovation here at home.
Well, lastly, President Trump's in China right now. I think you know a couple of people who are along for the ride. He's got half of corporate America, including an executive very close to you. Not to mention some of the folks, BlackRock, Blackstone, both represented. This is your world, in part, that traveled with the President of the United States to Beijing. Is this a trade mission? Do you expect actual deals to be announced, planes, ships, or anything else?
I think there's three big topics. First of all, we should never lose sight of the fact that China is our primary adversary.
Okay.
And that we are in a battle for global leadership, and they are seeking to displace us as a global superpower. So that's the context. With that, I embrace the idea of diplomacy to try to manage that relationship well. That's in our interest. It's in the world's interest. I think they'll talk about Iran. China and we have a alignment of interest to get this resolved. They're highly dependent on Iran for oil.
Can they help us reopen the strait?
The strait, if they can, I think they could. Certainly, I hope they will. They also are selling weapons and supporting the military capability in Iran. So there's a number of tough topics around that. But I think there's an opportunity. Second thing I think will be AI. This AI revolution is moving at a pace.
It's got Jensen on the plane.
It's unprecedented. So how do we ensure we have alignment and are managing that profound change in a responsible way with the other biggest country in the world that's also innovating at a very rapid pace? Third thing will certainly be trade. Trade and investment, and there's a number of things, whether it's soybeans that affects Pennsylvania farmers, and China living up to the commitments they made, whether it's rare earth metals. I mean, we're highly dependent on China. 70 or 80% of the rare earth metals we use in the United States come from China. And so we need to make sure that we have a reciprocal trade relationship. It hasn't been the case for decades. I think President Trump reset the table with that. We need to make sure China is living up to its part. And if it is, there's opportunity for both sides.
Republican Senator Dave McCormick of Pennsylvania speaking with us on Capitol Hill just hours after Kevin Warsh was confirmed as the new chair of the Federal Reserve. Let's bring it back to Kayleigh now in our Washington bureau. Kayleigh?
Well, Joe, thank you. We're just hours away from that summit between President Trump and China's President Xi Jinping that you were just discussing with Senator McCormick. Trump indicating that he will ask Xi to, quote, open up China and also discuss Beijing's role in the conflict in the Middle East. And joining me now for more is Gary Locke, former U.S. ambassador to China and former Commerce Secretary, both during the Obama administration. Sir, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. As a former ambassador and former Commerce Secretary, you are uniquely positioned to answer this question. Is this trip about diplomacy or is it about business?
Well, thanks very much, Kayleigh. I think we shouldn't have very high expectations in terms of the fundamental issues separating the United States and China, especially their economic policies, their subsidization of their businesses, and the flooding of world markets with low-cost goods. I think this is really going to be a trip of transactions. President Trump very badly needs, approaching the midterm elections, to have headlines saying that China is going to buy soybeans, Boeing airplanes, and beef, and perhaps helping all these CEOs that are on the trip reduce the barriers that they face in China. There is a truce on the trade war, but a lot of the tariffs that America has imposed have been invalidated by the courts. But China still has tariffs, retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, whether it's Teslas and things like that. And so I think a lot of the American CEOs want to see more access into China, reduction of some of these barriers. And China will want to say, okay, we're going to buy your soybeans and Boeing airplanes, but you've got to let us buy some more of these advanced chips, even though China will, in a few years, will not need these advanced chips from NVIDIA or any of our high-tech companies.
Well, and on that point, how telling was it to you, sir, that Jensen Huang joined the president en route, hopped on the plane in Anchorage, and he's going to be in these meetings, some of them?
Well, I think that's an indication that President Trump is perhaps going to relax some of the restrictions on these advanced chips that are being used in artificial intelligence. And again, China will say, okay, we're buying your stuff. You've got to also let us have some of the things that we need for our domestic consumption.
Well, and on the notion of making deals to buy things, we've heard this China's going to buy more U.S. soybeans story before. How do you guarantee the follow through, Ambassador?
Well, they actually made an agreement a few months ago in the meeting between the two leaders in Asia. And so far, China has followed through on its commitments. But I'm sure that both sides realize that following through on commitments will be very key to avoid an escalation of the trade war.
Well, and we've seen that the trade war filter into things like export controls, the U.S. obviously doing that when it comes to chips. But we've also seen China put into place restrictions on rare earth critical mineral exports, promising, of course, with the détente currently in place to allow more access to those. But that's still a lever that China has an ability to pull, is it not? How does the U.S. insulate itself against that particular problem, knowing how key it is to so much of the technology that we are talking about here?
Certainly, the United States is dependent on the rare earths and critical minerals coming from China. China really processes almost 99% of the stuff that we really need for our Patriot missiles, our cruise missiles, our jet fighters, and even Ford automobiles. While the United States is really trying to diversify and look at other sources of these rare earths and minerals, that will not happen for many, many more years. And so we're really at the mercy of China in the meantime. And that's why China has somewhat of an ace card hanging over the United States. So the United States and President Trump can't go too far in terms of restricting high-tech goods going into China, because China can turn right around and say, you're restricting these high-tech goods into China on the grounds of national security, on the grounds that maybe these high-tech semiconductors and equipment could be used by the Chinese military. Well, the China can turn around and is actually copying the United States with these export controls and saying, well, you know, these rare earths and critical minerals are being used in jet fighters and cruise missiles and Patriot missiles and things like that, and satellites, which could be used against us by the U.S. military. So both sides have to be very, very careful that they don't ramp up these controls too far.
Well, of course, Ambassador, this meeting, while there are all of these trade-oriented issues to discuss, is going to be somewhat overshadowed by the fact that there is still a closure of the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway which is a major energy conduit for the world, but for China, too, as the biggest buyer of Iranian oil that relies on the strait for export. We've heard a lot in the days leading up to this summit that Xi Jinping is not going to be too incentivized at this point to get more directly involved in attempts to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. But when is the turning point for China, even with all of the oil storage it was able to build up, where there's going to be too much of an economic threat for them to continue to stay on the sidelines?
Well, the reality is that China only gets about 6% of its total energy supply from the Gulf states and from Iran. Yes, they are the major purchaser of oil from Iran, but still makes a very minute portion of their energy supply. Less than 6% of their entire energy supply comes from either the Gulf states or the country of Iran. They are so heavily dependent on coal. But they are concerned about the impact of the blockade and of the closure of the straits in terms of the impact on the economy of the other countries around the world. Because if the economies of those countries go into a tailspin because of the lack of oil and natural gas, that will affect the buying power of those countries in terms of purchasing goods made in China. So China has an interest in making sure that the strait and the blockade, the strait is opened up and the blockade ends. But Iran is also a close ally of China. And so it will continue to say that the war should end, the strait should be opened up, and hostilities should cease. But it's not going to really pressure Iran very hard.
Well, of course, this conflict with Iran has led the U.S. to drawing down significant portions of our munitions stockpiles. There's an ongoing question as to what that means for our capabilities in other theaters should the need arise, including in the Pacific, which raises the question of Taiwan. Mr. Ambassador, having dealt in diplomacy with China specifically, you know how important the language around Taiwan is. And I wonder how great of an opportunity you think there may be for a misstep from President Trump in that regard.
Well, I'm sure his security advisors will be advising him and watching him very carefully and giving him input in terms of the language of the final communications that come out of the summit. But I think that President Xi will be trying to encourage President Trump to slow down the number of arms being sold to China, or decrease the amount of arms being sold to China, as a way to really fortify China's stance that Taiwan is really a part of the mainland.
All right. Former ambassador to China and former Commerce Secretary Gary Locke, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And coming up, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp is calling for a special session to consider redrawing the state's electoral map. We'll bring you the details next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kaylee Lyons in our Washington bureau. I'm Joe Matthew, live on Capitol Hill, where a short time ago, Kevin Warsh was confirmed to be the next chair of the Federal Reserve, happening the same day that President Trump touched down in China with a bevy of corporate executives in the hopes of reaching a deal on any number of issues when he sits down for a summit tomorrow with Xi Jinping. We send it back to the bureau right now with Kaylee Lyons. Kaylee?
Yeah, Joe, certainly there's a lot we're following tonight, including these stories in this evening's Power Brief. 2 lawmakers have written a letter to leading technology firms asking about how their large language models will handle political questions and bias ahead of this year's midterm elections. The letter, obtained by Punchbowl News, was written by Republican Congressman Mike Lawler of New York and Democratic Congressman Josh Gottheimer of New Jersey, and questioned firms including X, OpenAI, Microsoft, Meta, Google, Anthropic, and Perplexity. The lawmakers are asking the firms to file a written response to questions within the next 30 days. Right now, a potentially key Democratic primary remains undecided. In Nebraska's 2nd District, political activist Denise Powell currently has a slight lead over State Senator John Kavanaugh, with nearly 90% of the votes counted so far, according to the Associated Press. The seat, in a district Kamala Harris won in 2024, is seen as a potential pickup opportunity for Democrats. It's currently being held by Republican Congressman Don Bacon, who is set to retire at the end of this term. Republican Brinker Harding, who has been endorsed by President Trump, ran unopposed in Tuesday's primary. And Georgia's Republican Governor Brian Kemp Wednesday called for a special legislative session to redraw the state's congressional lines ahead of the 2028 elections. Kemp set the special session to begin on June 17th, one day after the state's primary runoff for this year's midterms. Georgia is now just the latest on a long list of states pursuing redistricting efforts with control of the House of Representatives in the balance. And next week, Balance of Power will be live from Georgia for coverage of its midterm primaries. But joining us tonight, ahead of that, is our political panel. Megan Hayes, Democratic strategist and former special assistant to President Biden, is with me alongside Republican strategist Sarah Chamberlain, president and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership. Welcome to you both. Just on this redistricting, it seems like we're following a new headline, a new state pursuing this effort each and every day. Georgia's going to go ahead for the next cycle. South Carolina apparently also going to be sitting this cycle out. Are we done here after this, Sarah, or is there more to come?
I think we're done after this. And I think actually Republicans will be in the net positives when all this is said and done, which after Virginia, we weren't sure. Obviously, it was a big victory for the Republicans, and it was a victory for Main Street because all 4 of those members are part of Main Street.
Well, when we consider a net positive for Republicans, that's assuming that the redrawn maps, which are in Republican or would be R plus X districts, Megan, are able to stay in Republican hands, even if they're being watered down and more Democratic voters from previously Democratic districts are being added to them. Those voters have to go somewhere, no?
Yeah, I just don't think that any of this is a guarantee, right? Like, you can redistrict however you want, but studies have shown over time that they normally don't. They may vote one way the one cycle, and the next cycle they go back to the way they were drawn previously. I also don't think voters like having their agency taken away from them in all of this redistricting for both Democrats and Republicans. But in Virginia, I think Democrats are still going to flip 2 seats. I think in Texas, they're grossly miscalculating redistricting seats that went heavily. Latinos went heavily for Donald Trump. Are not going to do that again in the 2026 cycle. I just read right before we came in here that Maryland is thinking about redistricting and redrawing their map. So I'm not sure that it's 100% over. It might be over in the South, but I'm not sure that it's all over. I wish it would all be over because I don't think it serves the voters well, and I think it's very confusing to people.
Well, certainly it is confusing to try to follow the headlines and developments. We do our best here on Bloomberg, but there's a lot else we have to follow, too, that is playing into the politics around these midterms. We looked at inflation data the last 2 days, Sarah, that came in hot, underscoring some of the price pressures that Americans are experiencing and the affordability challenges. How much does that affordability question erode Republicans' ability to retain the House, even with more drawn congressional districts in your favor?
Well, in all the polling, it's the #1 issue, except in one state where There's a lot of fraud going on. We all know that state. So Minnesota, fraud is number one. But other than that, affordability is the key issue. Republicans, we still have some time. Obviously, it's the war in Iran. It's the gas prices. We're in hopes that that will come to a conclusion shortly. And then the gas prices will come back down because that's really what was driving the inflation number. Well, how much is some time as the midterm gets closer and closer? When do you need to see gas prices moving down in a material way? Probably by around July 4th. Because people start to travel a lot by then. You know, they make their flight reservations. They're driving their cars. I mean, we need to do something with the price of gas, which is why gas tax potentially came up. Yeah, well, President Trump says he'd like to see a federal gas tax holiday. This is something that President Biden pushed for in 2022, the last time we were experiencing gas prices this high and inflation pressures like this. Is this smart politics, Megan?
I mean, sure, but I could give the president some advice. How about you just stop going into Iran and open the Strait of Hormuz, and the gas prices might come down quicker if we just, ended this conflict that was a war of choice. So I just think that there's some other things that he could be doing besides the gas tax. So whatever is going to give relief to the American people is what's going to be seen. I just don't know that the American people's minds aren't made up of who's caused this problem, and I think that the American people are going to blame the Republicans because of Donald Trump. Well, so it might be hard for any Republican to vote against this if it comes to the floor, Sarah, a gas tax holiday, that is. Is it your expectation that this would ultimately become reality? Because it never has before at the federal level. It never has, but I think this time it very well could be. And it could be done in a very bipartisan way, which would be very nice for a change. But most of the Republican Main Street Partnership members would vote for this, yeah. It doesn't seem, though, that Speaker Johnson or the Senate Majority Leader John Thune are super enthusiastic about this idea. Is this an area where the many can overwhelm the leadership and push for this? The many and the gentleman who's sitting right now in China, who's open to it. When he returns, make us a few phone calls, and you may see the legislation on the floor. Well, that's what I call a seg. The gentleman in China, of course, is the president, though he is not the only gentleman or gentle lady. He has a laundry list of corporate executives who are joining him. And I wonder how you read into that, Megan. Obviously, you've been involved in messaging at a White House around trips like this before. What message is he sending? He's showing that the United States has an extreme economic impact here, and these people and the leaders that went there, these CEOs, have a large stake in doing business with China at a favorable level. And I just think with between autos and semiconductors and chips and all these things that China plays an impact in, I think it's showing a measure of strength that the United States has a high economic investment in China and that they need to play ball. Well, and when we're talking about an attempt at making deals here, Sarah, is it the feeling on Capitol Hill that we want to be doing more business with China? Because I hear an awful lot coming from lawmakers about the competition and how they're our top adversary. So is it necessarily something we want to attract more money into the United States? So it depends on whom you speak with. Obviously, those who live in rural areas, farming is important. We need them to be buying our soybeans. We need them to be doing what they used to do as far as the ag side. There's mixed emotions with China about the other issues that hopefully the men and women who are there can work through it this week, especially around the chips issue. So we'll see how it all plays out. Well, and on the chips issue, Jensen Huang was not originally one of the people accompanying the president. He decided to change that mid-flight on Air Force One, had Jensen meet him in Anchorage at the refueling stop, and then he joined the trip. I would imagine that's not usually how these things go, especially with summits of this caliber and the intensity around them. Have you ever seen anything like that, Megan? I mean, you'd be surprised. People all of a sudden change their schedule. They get pressure from their colleagues and other people in their network of people. It takes one phone call from an Elon Musk or another CEO or their competition that's going to be there. And so then all of a sudden they feel pressure to go. So it's not unusual. It's a little suspect that he wasn't on the original list that was released from the White House. But I think it is important that he goes. China has an incredible handle on the rare earth minerals, and that we need to have this negotiation with them, and having these business leaders there is only positive for the United States. Well, and then there's, aside from the business aspects, the geopolitical factors to consider as well. President Biden had a misspeak or two on the issue of Taiwan that had to be cleaned up after the fact. How difficult is that line to walk now for President Trump as he's on this trip? I mean, these negotiations are tough. These conversations are tough. What is open to press is always very calculated. When you go on these trips, every single step is choreographed with the host government. So it is easy to follow the script. But it's not always easy when you get in the room and you get in front of press and you feel more comfortable and all of a sudden you say something that you shouldn't have said because it's the last person in your ear or whatever you think is a good negotiation tactic. So he needs to follow the line. I think a lot of our geopolitics here are going to be watched very carefully on what Trump is saying. And I think a lot of people in the national security atmosphere are worried about what he's going to say about Taiwan.
Well, and on the arms sales to Taiwan question as well, that's something that has overwhelming support on Capitol Hill, no?
Yes, it does. Absolutely. There's a lot of support for Taiwan. I do not see that diminishing at all. I think President Trump understands that going into these negotiations.
So you expect no material change in policy?
Material exchange.
It's not a chip at this particular table.
Not at this
in
point.
Your mind.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we will leave it there. Megan Hayes, Sarah Chamberlain, thank you both so much for joining us, covering what's going on abroad and here at home. And speaking of here at home, of course, Joe, you're still on Capitol Hill, where a lot of these issues, as we were just discussing with both Sarah and Megan, are live. You were just speaking with Senator Dave McCormick, who said that China is our #1 adversary, and yet also was heralding the business leaders who are on this trip.
Yeah, and, Republicans are going to try to thread the needle on that very issue, Kaylee. Of course, Richard Blumenthal, the Democrat from Connecticut, who also spoke with us this hour, took a very different tact. He said he's very uncomfortable with the fact that the president is traveling to China with all of these executives. He's very sensitive to AI and other tech advancements that he worries about getting into the wrong hands. And so this summit tomorrow is going to be awfully important. And you better believe that the lawmakers who are still at it with several votes ahead this evening, Kaylee, are going to have a lot to say about what President Trump does at this summit and what he potentially brings home.
Yep. And of course, we're going to have a lot to cover in that regard as well. You can always find coverage of that in the Washington edition newsletter on the terminal and online. And you can find us back here for Balance of Power tomorrow. Alongside Joe Matthew, who's live on Capitol Hill this evening, I'm Kaylee Lyons in Washington. And we'll see you then on Bloomberg TV and radio.